Hey, welcome back to Drowning in Yarn. I'm Caleb. I had such a good time talking with you last week about how I started planning for a sweater project. Right now I'm working on this Cozy Classic raglan, and last week we talked through what I think about whenever I'm picking a pattern, how I go about picking yarn, colors, and swatching so I can go about picking a size that I want to knit. I made some really good progress on my sweater, and this week I want to talk about the next steps. I figured I could chat with you about how I go about picking what size I'm going to do, because oftentimes I don't necessarily get gauge, but I like the fabric that I get, so that process can kind of differ, and I want to chat with you just about some tips and tricks as I go about knitting the sweater. So if you want to chat more about sweaters, stick around. So before we jump into the information, I wanted to remind you, if you're enjoying this sweater series and you're getting some value out of it, please go ahead and hit that like button below. And if you want to be notified when future videos come out, hit the subscribe button and the little bell next to it to get notifications. So the reason we're in my bedroom today to get started is because one of the first things that I did when I did my first sweater was to grab a sweater or sweatshirt, a shirt that I really liked the fit of, and to take some measurements. So I got out that first sweater that I used, or sweatshirt, and it is just your basic sweatshirt from Target. I think I paid $15 for this, but I really liked the way it fit. I tried on a few things in my closet, and this was the winner, so I grabbed this in order to start thinking about what size I wanted to knit. So the way that I used this sweatshirt as a tool to help me determine what size to knit was I laid it perfectly flat, and I measured the width across the chest from one armpit to the next. I then doubled that width and got basically the circumference that I wanted to knit. I knew that this sweatshirt provided an amount of ease that I liked, so I figured that if I aimed for a knitted garment that was about that circumference, I would achieve something similar to that amount of ease in the garment. The next thing that I did was measure from the armpit on down to the bottom of the hem, because I enjoyed the length of the sweater. Now I did find that it was maybe half an inch too short, so then I wrote down the length of this sweatshirt plus a half an inch, and that was the measurement that I was going to aim for the length of my body when I knit my sweater. So I did measure the sleeves as well. I don't know that that measurement ended up being super useful for me. I measured from this seam here where the sleeve started and measured right on down to the bottom of the cuff. I think it's hard to match that seam in the sweater that I started my measurement from to the live stitches on your waist yarn that you're going to pick up and then knit your full sweater sleeve. So I found for me the best way was to not worry about the length of the sleeve on this garment and to just try the sleeves on as I went. I figured with my first sweater, I would kind of determine how long I like to knit the sleeves, and I can save that measurement, though I really just knit the sleeves as I go every time and just stop whenever I feel like I like it. So now I told you how I went about finding measurements that I liked. Next, I'm going to talk about how I take the swatch that I have and translate that into the knitted garment that will match this dimension. Oftentimes, I found that patterns don't have the dimension that I want. I like a chest that's 41 inches around. That to me provides the perfect amount of ease. I feel like it hugs my body the way that I want without being too tight or too baggy. So that's the measurement that I aim for. Oftentimes I found in certain patterns, I'll see like a 40 inch and then a 43 inch or a 42 inch. Those measurements are reasonably close, but they're not really what I'm going for. So I would either, if I had spot on gauge, I would pick the closest size, probably rounding up, because I would rather have a little bit of extra ease. 1 inch of ease isn't really that big of a deal to me. Or if my gauge is off, I will take my gauge that I have and do some math in my pattern to figure out which of the sizes gets me closest to that 41 inch measurement that I really like and I aim for every time. So once I know what size I'm aiming for, I'm able to then take that information and the information that I've gathered from my swatch and pick a size in the pattern. I figured I would show you the ideal situation, the situation that I'm in with the Cozy Classic raglan, where I have gauge, and with my other swatch that I showed you in the last episode where I did not get gauge, I could show you how I would take that swatch and pick a size that would get me close to my desired 41 inch. If you're an experienced sweater knitter, you know how to do this, But if you're a new sweater knitter, this may save you if you're having trouble getting gauge. I do know some other sweater knitters who've knit one or two sweaters but haven't really done this, and so I figured it's worth talking about. It is something that I do all the time, and I found to be a skill that is extremely useful in my sweater knitting kind of toolbox. So this is a paid pattern, so I'm only going to show you the small bits of information that we need to make the determination of what size from the pattern I'm going to knit. Now I'm going to be using my iPad. It's my main knitting tool because I use Knit Companion with PDF patterns so that I can mark them up with my Apple Pencil. It just helps me stay organized. I highlight all the numbers that pertain to the size that I'm knitting, and I write down all of the pertinent information that I need to remember, such as the gauge that I got, the needles that I'm using for ribbing and for the body. Because for instance, with this sweater, I forgot to do that. I knit the body, went to start the ribbing, and couldn't remember what needle I used. So I kind of guessed and got reasonably close, I guess. And I wrote that one down so that I could use it for the cuffs. It just helps me stay organized and helps me not miss anything because I'm just very unorganized and forgetful. And I'll forget all those things, especially if I set it aside and come back to it. Or if I want to knit another one in the same yarn. It's helpful for me because I'm not always great about updating my projects on my Ravelry page. So this is kind of where I keep all that information for myself to keep me organized. So I'm just going to grab the two swatches that we had done before, and this swatch, which is the swatch that I ultimately went with, matched the pattern's gauge of 18 stitches to 4 inches, which is 4.5 stitches an inch. This swatch was slightly off at 4.75 stitches per inch. And this was on a US 7, which I believe was the needle called for in the pattern. In order to achieve gauge, I had to go up to US 8, which is what I've been knitting the body on. So now that I know how many stitches per inch that I have for each of these swatches, I could go to the part in the pattern where you separate for the sleeves. You can just go hunting in the pattern, find that point, and then those numbers with the gauge are all you need to know. Jessie May has thought of everything, and she actually details this process in an abbreviated form in her pattern to tell you how to achieve the size that you want with the gauge that you have. So if you're not familiar with knitting a top-down sweater, you cast on for the neck, you knit down increasing. I usually try it on and make sure that the fabric kind of passes just below my underarm, and that's kind of whenever I know that I'm good to go to separate for the sleeves. But at that point in the pattern, which we're going to jump to before we ever get started, you will see in every pattern I've ever worked, it will say you separate for the sleeves, and then the next step will tell you, kind of as a check-in point, you should have an X number of stitches for the body, and then those numbers with the gauge are all you need to know. I know that the closest size in this pattern to my desired size of 41 inches is 42 inches. That is the third size listed, so that's where I'd start. That is 188 stitches. So if I just do a little bit of math and I take 188 and divide it by 4.5, we know I'm going to get 42 inches. In this case, it's 41.777, close enough. So this swatch at 4.5 stitches an inch is going to get me that desired finish size. This one at 4.75 stitches an inch would, at 188 body stitches, get me a sweater with a finished size of 39.5 inches. If I then take that swatch that had 4.75 stitches an inch and go up to the next size at 206 stitches, that's going to give me a sweater with a circumference of 43 inches. So this gauge, though I really like the fabric, is just not going to be a successful gauge for me, which is why I didn't stop with this swatch and I went on to do the second swatch to get a gauge that worked. This swatch would give me a sweater that's too tight or too big, and I didn't want either of those things. You can kind of see how the number of stitches per inch plays with the size of the garment. If you have more stitches per inch, you're going to end up with a smaller garment. If you have less stitches per inch, you're going to end up with a larger garment. You experienced sweater knitters know this and probably have played this game, but this was a new thing to me whenever I started knitting sweaters. And I actually did this for my first sweater and figured out how to get the size that I wanted, because that pattern had 40 inches and 43 inches and I was in between, and it worked out perfectly. I would say don't do this if the difference is huge, But if the difference is small, it's probably going to work out in your favor. You can be reasonably sure that you'll end up with the size that you want. I do this exercise all the time because, like I said, I often don't get gauge and I'm often too lazy to re-swatch. The only time that I don't kind of settle for the gauge that I have is, one, if I don't like the fabric, which wasn't the case here, or two, if the gauge that I have will not get me to a finished size that I desire. If that math just isn't going to work out, then I'm definitely going to re-swatch. Now, also, you have to think, do I want to knit 206 stitches per round or 188? Because over the body of a sweater, that's going to add up and it's going to take extra time, and who knows how much extra yarn. You definitely want to have a little bit of extra yarn because you could be using it more. I don't really know how that works out because I always buy extra and have not yet had to worry. But that's something to take into consideration whenever you're doing this. I would just say always have a little bit extra yarn. Now, if I ever was to kind of run out and just needed that little bit extra, I would just pull out my swatch and use that. So with these speed swatches, I never cut the yarn in the back. I leave it so that if I need a little bit extra yarn, I can just unravel my swatch even though it's blocked and use that yarn. It's perfectly good yarn and there's no reason not to use it if you're about to run out. So in order to demonstrate the next thing that I always think about and do whenever I'm knitting a sweater, I did a little bit of a costume change into the first sweater that I ever knit. This is a Tin Can Knits Flax. It was knit in Wool of the Andes from Knit Picks. Super cost effective. I think I paid like $40 for all the yarn and had extra. But one thing that I didn't realize when I made this sweater was that, and should be very obvious, but once I increased down to the largest part of the sweater, which is the size that I needed to fit my chest comfortably, I then was just going to knit the body straight down. So this size, which was a 41-inch circumference, was going to be the same size all the way down. Now this seems obvious now because I did not increase nor decrease, but at the time it didn't occur to me that that may not work for my body. Because of my posture, I like my sweater to hug my back a little bit. It just kind of makes me look a little bit better. It's just more flattering. So I don't like the same size up here as I like down here. For me, that means decreasing a little bit. For you to achieve that same kind of thing, it may mean that that one size is perfect. It may mean that you might want a little bit of extra room. The most important thing is just to know what you are going to want and how you're going to want it to fit your body. And I didn't think about that when I knit this sweater. So what ended up happening was I knit this sweater. I finished it super quickly because I was very motivated. And then I set it aside and never wore it because it didn't fit right. It was this big boxy thing. I figured I was not going to be able to knit a sweater that would fit my body. Super discouraging, and it put me off knitting sweaters for a while. I brought this up to the women at my yarn store, and they told me, "Oh, bring it in. You know, we can figure it out. We can fix it." And that was a super generous offer. But I didn't end up needing to do that only because as I was looking at some sweaters online, I saw that somebody mentioned that they tapered the body of their sweater in order to get a better fit. And it just clicked that that was what I needed to do because to achieve the desired ease throughout the sweater, I needed less fabric down here. So what I did was just completely unravel it up to about here. And then I started doing decreases on the sides. In order to do that, I just eyeballed it, to be honest. I don't know that that was the best thing to do for a couple of reasons. So the first reason would be that it would be smarter to plan this, to measure myself here, determine the difference that I wanted in ease, to figure out using my gauge how many stitches that translated to, and to plan out my decreases so that my taper ended up being smooth and almost imperceptible, because my goal was not to achieve like a V shape because that doesn't exist in my body, so it would not have worked, but just to achieve a very nice taper. That is not what I did. And I did not rip back far enough. So what ended up happening was I kind of have these wings here and a smaller body down here. Now, I would say I salvaged this sweater because I have worn this sweater out. In the winter, I'll throw my jean jacket over it because I'm always in a jean jacket and wear it, and nobody knows. Even if I wore it like this, people probably aren't going to know, but I'm going to know that I have these wings and I don't love it. So that made this sweater not the best sweater, but it's a wearable sweater and I do like it. What I've done since is the same thing. I taper the body of my sweater. I start as soon as I slit for the sleeves. I'll place a stitch marker at the center of the underarm, and as I go down, I'll decrease out some stitches, often just one stitch per round, starting almost immediately. I would say maybe half an inch or an inch after I separate for the sleeves. I don't plan it out still. I just kind of do it, and then I'll get to a point where I think it's gonna fit, or I wanna try it on and try it on, maybe decrease some more, try it on, and just eyeball it. And once I'm happy with it, I just kind of knit the rest of the body. That has worked out for me, to be honest, so I haven't felt the need to plan. But I would suggest that you measure yourself if you're gonna do this, and you measure yourself down here and plan out your increases or decreases. Now this process is super simple with plain sweater like this. I don't have to think about a pattern as long as I end up with the same multiple. So if it's an even number of stitches, which I think it always is, then you just want to end up with an even number of stitches because you don't want to end up with ribbing that's not going to work out because you're going to have two purls or two knits next to each other. But you really can't go wrong, because if you're just knitting a plain sweater like this, you're just going to get to the bottom and bind off after your ribbing, so you can add or decrease as many as you want. This process will still work if you're doing a patterned sweater. It's just different. Whenever I did my Lee Lanau sweater, which I have right here, which you will have seen if you watch one of my previous episodes where I discuss some of my favorite patterns and projects, which I'll provide a link to. But this sweater differs in that it is a bottom-up sweater. I increased rather than decreased to achieve my taper, but the principle is exactly the same. I did the increases in this case on the side. You will notice that it has disrupted the pattern. I took into account how that worked and tried to minimize the disruption, and it didn't end up being a problem. But I would say if you're going to increase or decrease, you definitely want to consider if you have a stitch pattern, but it's still doable. Now, I don't think that everybody would like this technique, particularly if you're going for an oversized sweater, but for me, I found it's the only way that I like the way my sweaters fit, and achieving a custom fit is one of the main benefits of making your own sweaters. And so I just don't see why I wouldn't do it, because otherwise I'm going to end up with something that I don't like the way it fits, and what was the purpose in spending a month of my life making it if I don't like the size? So I do this with every sweater. So far it's helped me achieve top-down seamless sweaters that are a little bit more fitted than they might otherwise be, and it's made me love those sweaters just that much more because of it. So the last couple of things that I think about as I'm knitting a top-down sweater are just how long I want it. I do take that measurement so that I kind of have a guide of how long it's going to be, but the way that I really know when I'm ready to stop is I just try it on constantly. I'll use long circular needles and use 2 circular needles, knit with that second circular so that I have my sweater half on one circular and half on the other, and try it on. I find that that's easier than transferring all my stitches to waste yarn so that I can try it on, then having to transfer them back off the waste yarn onto needles. I find that that's just faster. Then whenever I've determined that I'm going to keep knitting or I'm finished and I need to get it back onto the one set of needles, I'll just knit it back onto one needle, and then I just stop when I eyeball about 2 inches, 1.5 inches above the length that I want, and then just switch to ribbing and bind off. To bind off, I oftentimes just do 2 or 3 needle sizes bigger and make sure that I'm binding off super loosely. The last thing you want is to not be able to get the sweater on, which I've done. Now, here's where I'm going to ask for your help, because I do this, and this is what I just did with my Cozy Classic Raglan. I knit the ribbing in a size 4, but I switched back to the body needle, the 8, to do the bind off. It is stretchy enough. It fits over me. It doesn't look cinched, but I notice that I pull it to its limit as I'm putting it on. It doesn't feel super stretchy. So I don't know that this is the best advice, so I would love to hear what you do to bind off your sweaters. Now, to cast on, I similarly use a larger needle, 2 to 3 sizes larger, just to do my cast on at the neck. And that has always provided me a cast on that's stretchy enough to fit over my head comfortably, and I've had no issues with that. It also just helps to ensure that you have a really neat looking cast on edge. But I'd also love to hear what you do for the cast on if you've done this a lot. So definitely leave a comment and let us all know how you cast on to ensure a stretchy cast on and how you bind off to ensure a stretchy bind off, because I would love to know. I have thought about doing Ginny's surprisingly stretchy bind off, but I wonder if that's overkill, and I definitely don't want a flare. So I would love to hear what you have to say. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about in this video was how I go about knitting my sleeves. Whenever you're knitting a top-down sweater and you separate the sleeves from the body, you put the sleeve stitches on waste yarn and put them on hold. And whenever I finish the body and go back to begin knitting my sleeves, in that first row of knitting, I'll put a stitch marker in a stitch and leave it, because I find that it's easier to measure the sleeve. If you just start knitting, I can't ever tell where I started. So if I end up doing the sleeves one at a time and I want to measure them to see that they're the same length, having some sort of progress keeper for the whole sleeve makes that process simpler. Now I'll also, every time that I start, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, but I'll put a progress keeper in that knitting for that day so that I can see how long my sleeve is getting. I just find that it provides motivation as I'm on sleeve island, as people like to say. So if I'm halfway through my sleeve and I set it down for the day and I come back and I pick it up the next day and start knitting, I just find it's hard to tell how much I've knit, and so it makes it feel never ending. Whereas if I have a progress keeper in a stitch for that session, I can tell like, oh, I've knit an inch, I'm making progress, so I'm more likely to want to speed up that progress or just have that sense of satisfaction that I crave whenever I'm knitting. The other thing that I like to do whenever I'm knitting my sleeves one at a time is to write down in my pattern anything that I do that isn't exactly what the pattern says, so that I can replicate it in my other sleeve. This includes mistakes. If I make a mistake somewhere and it's a noticeable mistake, I'm going to make the same mistake in my other sleeve so that that mistake becomes a design feature and not some flaw that is going to like haunt me or be noticeable to somebody else. And you'll notice that I keep saying when I knit my sleeves one at a time, and you may wonder, why am I saying that? Some of you are going to have done 2 at a time sleeves and some won't have. My preferred way to knit my sleeves is on magic loop 2 at a time. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, it makes having 2 identical sleeves easy. It's just built into the process, because whenever you're doing 2 at a time, you knit across one sleeve, you knit across the other, and then you come back and you finish those 2 rounds. It's not that that is faster. I don't know that it's faster at all. It's just mentally, I feel like I'm making progress on both at the same time. And when I have that progress keeper, even if it's like an inch that I knit, that is automatically 2 inches. And so I just feel like I'm making more meaningful progress for me. I also feel that it gets me off sleeve island quicker, because when I'm done with both sleeves. I don't have to knit a whole sleeve and then say, great, now I have to knit a whole other one. Because a sleeve isn't my favorite part. I mean, there's nothing wrong with knitting a sleeve, but you know, it's not the most satisfying thing because there's not a lot of shaping other than some basic decreases. It's just a long tube that can feel never ending. And so doing 2 at a time provides a little bit more interest because, you know, you're moving the needle around as you're doing a magic loop, you're doing some ball management so that you don't end up with tangled yarn. And there's just a little more thought, but like that kind of a rhythmic thought that you just get into this motion of doing it all. And before you know it, you have 2 sleeves and you're done with your sweater. And I just kind of prefer that process. Now there are some times where I don't prefer 2 at a time sleeves. For instance, on my Leelanau sweater with the light stitch pattern, because I had 2 colors going, I had 2 balls of yarn attached to my sweater at all times. And if I would have done 2 at a time sleeves, I would have 4 balls of yarn. For this sweater, because I am knitting with the fingering weight yarn and the mohair yarn at the same time, I will have 4 balls of yarn going if I do 2 at a time sleeves. But I think I'm going to take the challenge on this sweater and do it in that manner just to see if it's as miserable as I think or if it's a process that works. I do have kind of a rhythm that I get into with 2 at a time sleeves where I don't think that tangling is going to be a problem. So I'm up for that challenge. But that's kind of something that you would want to think about if you're going to tackle 2 at a time sleeves, and that's just kind of how I thought about it in the past. and why I'm gonna try it this time, just to give myself that challenge. And so I'm gonna do them 2 at a time this time. Now, before I wrap up, I just wanted to leave you with a few final reminders. These are almost reminders for myself, but I just thought I'd vocalize them so I can go back and look at them whenever I need them. I just think that for me, I fall into this trap where I feel like I need to get to the end of the project. I need to finish. I'm having that problem with this Cozy Classic Raglan where I just get so excited to be done that I forget to enjoy it as I go along. And that's something I need to stop, because the process is more important than the finished project. I mean, this is my hobby and I need it to be fun. It cannot be another source of stress for me, and I need to remind myself sometimes, don't be stressed. There's nothing that important about finishing this sweater that I shouldn't slow down and have fun with it. Related to that is also this idea that I can't make mistakes, that it needs to be perfect, and that's just not true. If I make mistakes, oftentimes I learn from those mistakes, and one of my favorite things about knitting is I've yet to find something that I can't fix in some way. Even if that is ripping back like I did with this sweater in order to reknit something. I may have spent a lot of time on something that doesn't ultimately get used, but I spent that time learning, because being wrong has always proved in my life to be the best way to learn, because I don't like being wrong, so I take from that a lot. I take from it the experience of correcting myself, the experience of becoming more comfortable with being wrong, and then being excited whenever I get past that hump, and I'm less likely to make the same mistakes in the future. So if my sweater doesn't turn out the way that I want, I take that as an opportunity, or I should take that as an opportunity to learn from the mistake I made and be better in the future. So far that's true. For instance, with this sweater where it had the more boxy fit and I learned that I like a taper, I would never have learned that so quickly, and I may have repeated the same mistakes if I didn't recognize what I disliked about this sweater, how I made the mistake, or how I went about creating something that I didn't absolutely love, and then go about fixing that thing. That process helped me learn so much about the process that I want to do moving forward and how I like my finished project to be. I have to appreciate the fact that I had to rip this sweater back and reknit it. And ultimately, I love knitting, so more knitting shouldn't be a terrible thing, right? So I think that really wraps up most of my thoughts on sweater knitting. I really hope that you've enjoyed this, and if I've left any loose ends or you have questions, absolutely leave me comments down below. If I can't answer them, maybe somebody else can. And I would love to see your sweater. So if you're making a sweater, especially if you're making your first sweater, tag me on Instagram. My name on there is Drowning in Yarn. If you got any value out of this video, I'd love if you hit the like button. It really does help me out. And if you aren't already subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button too, and the little bell next to it if you want to get notifications. It really helps me grow this channel, and I would love to have you along for future videos. But I've really enjoyed talking to you about sweater knitting. It's one of my favorite things, and I hope you've enjoyed this as well. And if it's not one of your favorite things yet, I hope it is someday soon. So I'll talk to y'all later.